Hello everyone. Today I'm going to be going over somewhat of a more basic tutorial, simply because I'm planning on doing a more in-depth tutorial on this soon, as soon as I can figure out how to present it. But this is basic animation tutorial, or in-depth basic animation. So to start off with, animation is going to be right here in animate in your assembly menu, and there's action recorder and record possession. A lot of you probably have done that before. Action recorder is what they used to do like moving platforms in all the demos that you've probably seen of the game. It's really simple to animate something like that, but it's not for in-depth animations or anything past simple gameplay and stuff like that. And record possession, that's kind of like puppeteering or making a car drive from what you do. So it's moreover something that you would want to do, not in an animation, but in a game, moreover. So, first thing that we're going to start off with are keyframes and timelines. Now, timelines on their own are just a blank slate, and by default, if you play time, it just simply goes from one end of the timeline to the other, and then it stops. Now, if we go ahead and look at the properties of the timeline, we can see quite a lot of things. This first page is what really we're looking at for animations, because the other two pages are really for sounds. If you are making an animation that has sounds on it, this page, if you understand the sound channels, is kind of useful. But the beat and sidebar, that's more for music. So what we're looking for is on the first page, which is playback speed. That will let you speed up and slow down your timeline. And then there's playback mode. So by default, it's going to be sustain. Basically, that means when you give it power, it'll play, and when you turn it off, it'll keep the playhead where you last left it, like so. And then there's loop, so it will go ahead and play. If you turn it off, it will reset to the end, or to the beginning. And if it goes to the very end, it will go back to the start and keep playing, as long as it's powered. Restart timeline will forcibly make your timeline go back to the beginning. On end trigger will basically send out a pulse when the timeline ends, like so. You can see it just barely. And the playhead position is on, basically it makes a number between 0 and 1, depending on how far along the playhead is on your timeline. So at 0, 0, 0, it would be a 0 output. And at the very end of the timeline, which would be 8 seconds here, it would be 1. Ignore frame rate basically is for music. If you make it ignore frame rate, it doesn't matter how slow the game is running, whatever's on here will be playing in real time, instead of the console's interpreted FPS. And that's basically the basics of a timeline. And now, for keyframes. A lot of you who are watching this may have never heard of keyframes or done anything animation oriented. Well, keyframes are an industry standard. You're going to find them literally in any animation program. They basically are what the game or engine or whatever animation is looking at for the position of anything or the rotation. Basically, it stores data of anything. And a keyframe is, in more advanced animation is a very important frame that shows off the precise detail that you want. And in-betweens are basically spots between two keyframes that can be kind of interpreted either by the engine, or an animation can have like smears and stuff like that, so it's not like striking. But that's more for traditional like 2D animation. But with keyframes in 3D animation, keyframes basically distinguish key poses and positions that you want, and rotations that you want things to be at. So if we go ahead and open up the properties of the keyframe here, you can kind of see the in-betweens that I'm talking about up here. Depending on the blend type, you're going to get a different style of in-between. Linear is just going to directly move a cube between point A and point B, and then ease in is going to slowly move the cube at the start, and then at the end it's going to be really fast, and ease out is opposite. Ease both is, well, both at once, so it's slow to start, fast, and then slow to end. Ease strength changes basically the easing, I guess. Springiness, you really don't need to worry about some of these when it comes to animation. You can use keyframes for a lot of other things other than animation, because you can also store pretty much anything in a keyframe regarding data. Like, for example, you can store the color of the ground here and the tint amount, and you can turn this on and it'll change, because active, it's changing the properties of the data that you have stored in it. So if I can go ahead and delete that, just have an empty keyframe now. And slow power up and slow power down, that is also kind of, it can be important in some animation instances, but in traditional animation it's not really. But if you, for example, want a cube to go from point A to point B over time, and you just have the singular keyframe, you can change it to a slow power up, and the cube will slowly move to that position instead of an instant teleportation effect. And the same thing goes for slow power down, it'll be in reverse. So now that we have that out of the way and I've explained what keyframes are, we're going to go ahead and start making a simple animation with keyframes. I'll show off a couple of styles that we can do. So I just stamped down a cube with sculpt mode, and we're going to do a simple platform like we would do with an action recorder. In fact, I think we'll go ahead and record that now. We'll make a copy of the cube to start with. I'll make 3 copies of the cube actually, because we're going to be doing 2 animation styles with the keyframes. So with an action recorder, you just place it down and do your best to move the cube to the position you want, and then you bring it back like so. If you play, it's going to do exactly what you did, or at least as best as possible. Alright, next animation style would be just to have a bunch of keyframes distinguish the position. So we want a keyframe, so go ahead and go to animate, keyframe, and we're going to smack it on this timeline that we have here. And I'm going to turn on precise move for this, and we're going to go ahead and R2. Now, animating this specifically, doing R2 or L2 is going to give you positional data for your keyframe. Now, positional data is basically an absolute, so it will force any object as best as possible to go to this position that you're setting, and that includes rotations as well as positions. So after that explanation, so we have set the position here, and when we are thinking of what we're doing with this animation up here, we're going from point A to point B, back to point C, or back to point A. So that would be 3 different keyframes. So we have the first keyframe here, and we're going to go ahead and make a copy of it, and we're going to go ahead and put it halfway across the timeline, so about 4 seconds. And we're going to go ahead and do L1 and X between the 2 keyframes, and that's going to give us a blend. So basically, imagine there's like a bunch of keyframes in between the 2 keyframes we made, and that's those are the in-betweens. So we just made the animation make a bunch of in-between frames before us between these 2 keyframes with this blend. Now I'm going to go ahead and edit the second keyframe and move it to our second point. This is over here. We'll get to the hand later. And now if we go ahead and play that animation, you can see it smoothly animates to the right and then snaps back because we have this turned off. And now the next part of the animation is simply to move back. Well, that's pretty easy. We can do that by just copying the first keyframe over and moving it to the very end of the timeline. And since this animation loops, we're going to go ahead and change the properties of the timeline to loop, and also make sure that we have those in-between frames with that blend as well. And now we have a nice smooth moving platform. You can also increase the time that the cube is in those positions by just increasing the size of the keyframe. So for example, if we wanted it to wait a second at that position before we have it come back, you can go and change the keyframe size to a second long. And we're going to do the same with our starting keyframe, so it stays here for a second as well. Alright, and that's basically that style of animation. It's not much of a style, but it's more of a preference, because this way you have a little bit more control. For example, instead of just moving between the 2 points, you can have the actual different interpolations. So you can have the ease in and ease out, and you're going to get a different animation. You can see it kind of like snaps, like so. Now the next one, so we're going to go ahead and get another keyframe from our animate menu. I'm going to go ahead and place it down, and we're just going to actually move our cube here, our next one, into the second position. Stop recording. Then we're just going to change the size of this keyframe to make it fit the entirety of the timeline. Now you may be asking yourself, well, how can I animate with just one timeline? Well, keyframes have a thing called, well, a lot of things actually have this, but they're called faders, and faders allow you to slowly turn on. So it's basically making this, but it's still powered on. It's only partially powered on. So if we go ahead and move our fader over, well, I'm going to move the start of the animation over to 1 second so we get that same pause. Then I'm going to move our fader over from the beginning to this 4 second mark, and then we're going to move the fader on the right to the 5 second mark, so we still get that 1 second pause at the beginning and when it's on the other end. And if we go ahead and play now, you can see it moves over, pauses, and it comes back. And you get a little bit less control with this because you don't get the in-betweens, so you can't decide like the speed with just one keyframe. but you're still able to achieve something with 2 less keyframes, which is pretty good. Now, I'm going to go ahead and turn off this timeline, and I'm going to move over to this hand, and we're going to get a new timeline from our animate menu. And now in here, there's a couple things I want to go over with a keyframe with you guys. We're going to go ahead and scope into our hand here, and I believe it's all rigged up and ready to go. So with anything that is jointed, as in if we go to show/hide, turn on X-ray, turn on connectors, anything that has these kind of connectors in them, they will allow you to rotate them, and you're not actually animating the object itself, you're animating the joint. So you're setting the rotation of this joint and the position this rotation is at. So instead of setting a direct position, you are setting a rotation. Now, this is different because with positions, the way they interpolate between 2 keyframes, so for example, if I had made a cube, another cube, and I go ahead and place down 2 keyframes, one here, and I make it go up, and then I make another keyframe, and I make it go down, only one of these is going to actually work properly when I turn on the animation, or nothing happens at all. So if I turn this one off on the right, it'll go up, and I turn this one off on the left, it's going to go down. But that's not true for rotation. If you have 2 keyframes, I'm going to go ahead and delete that keyframe for now. If you have 2 rotational keyframes, one that's telling it to go 90 or 100 degrees in one direction, and then another keyframe that's telling it to go to a completely different position, maybe even to the side, like so. If I can get it like that, it's going to have no problem playing both of these. So that one and this one, and it's going to move into a interpolated point between the 2 animations that you're putting down. So instead of just canceling the animation that it's trying to do, it's blending them. And this is important for anything that you're doing that is gameplay-wise advanced, as if you want, for example, to have an animation for holding a weapon or making a slash animation, and you want your character to crouch as well, but not always crouching, you're going to want to have to animate that crouching. And if you animate the crouching, a direct position for the player's arms for an animation are going to try to move the hands up to the original position it was at. So unless you have a really low attack animation, crouching and attacking at the same time is not going to look very well if you use positional data. And again, positional data is doing R2 on the object. So if I go ahead and delete the data and then do R2, you can see it's a brownish, tannish color. But if I do L2 and just rotate, it's a greenish, light green color. Right? So if we want to make an animation here with this hand, probably would want to do rotational data. Now, there's nothing against doing positional data because connectors also do something else special with keyframes. As in, if you do positional data, the connectors that are leading up to the object you're doing the positional data will move along kind of like an arm would following a hand. So basically you are able to get way better control of your animations if you do positional data, because you can basically tell the hand where you want it to go, and that's pretty easy, but nobody wants to spend 30 minutes getting the rotation of the arms right. So if you just want, for example, this finger to be pointing this way, like this, but you didn't want to have to rotate these all the way to that point, you can do this, and then you can go ahead and turn this on, and then you can actually tap the finger, and then if you delete this, it's going to stay this position, which is good, because now if we get a keyframe, we can just tap all the parts of the finger that we want animated, and now we have a rotational animation rather than a positional animation. Now that would be good, because if we had that position animation and we moved our hand up and down like this, or moved the larger part of the hand like this in the group, then the finger is going to try to stay in this position where it is constantly, which is not good. You don't want that. And one other problem is you may experience the finger, or not finger, or just anything, you want to have it snap back to the original position for animation purposes. Well, you can use the same trick. You can have a keyframe, and you can have it set up so it's animating the default pose of everything in the puppet. And when you go ahead and turn this on, it's going to set the default pose, and then you can go ahead and grab everything and then turn it off. And then it'll have the default pose and not have the animation, or not have the default pose, which is basically how it is before you're playing any animation. That's more functional on a puppet, because a puppet you're going to want to have the arms at the side. So if you make it in like an aiming position, and then you get that rotational data after you're doing the positional rotation or positional keyframe, you don't want them to be constantly aiming, and you don't want to spend that much effort to put their arms back in the same position they were previously. So you can use the same trick backwards. Now, we can actually animate this hand here. Let's make it open and close. So that's pretty easy, considering what we've already talked about. So I'm going to go ahead and close it to start off with. Oop. And when we go ahead and animate, we can use this style with just one keyframe, because that's going to be our easiest bet here. So I'm going to go and place one keyframe down, and then I'm going to go ahead and open everything up. And I'm going to go ahead and use positional data, because it's going to be easier. Now, you could go in and get the rotational data like I said, but we're not going to be doing any fancy gameplay mechanics with this hand now, are we? Sometimes rotation is a bit easier than position. Not all the time, though. There we go. And now we have animated the hand in an open state. So if we go ahead and drag this out to, let's just say 5 seconds. And we get that to start at 1 second, fade in until 3 seconds, and then it'll fade out at 4. So it opens, takes a little while to open, and then close a bit faster. And we're going to go ahead and make this loop. And you can see that there's a little bit of not what you want with that. So if you get that, then you can go ahead and delete the animation you have made, and in this case, rotations seems to be a bit better here. So I would go ahead and do that. And we also want to get this part of the pinky animated. See if that works any better. Yep. Alright. And also, I don't like how this animates, so let's see if that works. Yep. There we go. So, that was basic animations. And basic animation information, I guess. Hope you guys liked this video. Go ahead and like, comment, and subscribe. I am going to be putting out hopefully another video on animations very soon about just basically animating a humanoid for idle, and then animating a humanoid for maybe cinematics, and animating for anything that isn't a humanoid but still a creature, I guess. I mean, I have a live stream where I animated a 6-legged thing. It's not very, it's not something that you just do. You have to see references for it, or you have to know how things move in that way. It's not something I can necessarily teach, but I can give pointers on it. So, yeah, thank you all. Comment, like, and subscribe. Have a nice rest of your day. Bye.